House prices and house values are not the same thing. My great-grandma was born in 1925, when the average price of a house in Britain was around £500. Now, the same houses are 275 grand. That's over 500 times more expensive just throughout my grandma's lifetime. Houses are not the only thing that have skyrocketed in price. Just about everything has. I used to go shopping on the way to school with 20 pence, and that was enough to buy a chocolate bar or some sweets. So why is everything going up in value? The answer is that it isn't. The value doesn't have to change for the price to increase. When people say that houses double in value every 10 years, you could argue that they don't. House prices tend to double every 10 years, that's undeniable, but house values? No. House prices are subjective depending on what type of money you're talking about. The only reason prices go up in relation to the British pound is because the British pound is losing value every time the government prints more money. If you owned 200 gold coins in 1924, that'll be enough to buy a house. And today, if you owned the same 200 gold coins, that would also buy a similar house today. Therefore, if you saved gold instead of saving cash, then inflation wouldn't affect you. The only reason people are broke today is because they work for and save cash, fake money that's being printed. The media is obsessed with house prices. They print stories about house prices almost as much as the Bank of England prints money. But you must remember, house prices are subjective depending on what currency of money you're referring to. You must also remember the owner of the media outlets are very rich. They write the articles in the full knowledge that you will base your financial decisions from these articles. And most people are like sheep. They believe what they read and they don't do their own due diligence. The system is rigged to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. In 2020, the government locked everybody inside their houses, required everybody to wear masks, and closed down most small businesses from trading. And this lasted for around 18 months. And as a result, people went into financial panic and we went into a recession. A recession is defined as when a country's GDP, gross domestic product, declines for 2 consecutive quarters. It was laughable when they announced that we're in a recession, because it was a completely manufactured recession. Of course, we're spending less money and GDP is down because we're unable to leave our houses. The first 6 months of lockdown was grim, not just for the country, but for the world. In the UK alone, over 500,000 house sales were halted, and we saw a sharp dip in house prices. The media outlets were very negative about property prices and investing, and the general guidance was to hold fire because house prices are about to crash. I was like a lone ranger in the wilderness predicting that house prices were actually about to boom. Everybody laughed at me. I could see firsthand that rich people themselves were buying up properties like they were going out of fashion, including Lloyds Banking Group. The Bank of England printed hundreds of billions of pounds during the pandemic and lowered base rate twice in March, first from 0.75% to 0.25%, and then just 2 days later to a staggering 0.1%. And this was the lowest base rate ever been from the beginning of central banks coming into existence. This meant that in 2020, you could borrow money from the banks almost with zero interest. 0.1. How base rate works is that the Bank of England loans its printed money to other banks at base rate. And then the banks lend that same printed money to their customers at a higher amount to make a profit. In 2020, you could get a mortgage fixed as low as 1.5%. This means if you took out a mortgage for £100,000, your monthly interest payments would be £125. During this time, I refinanced a large chunk of my property portfolio for 5 to 7 years at 3.3% fixed, in the knowledge that rates would increase. The longer you fix the term, the higher the rate. because the banks all knew that rates would later increase. Base rate stayed at 0.1% for almost 2 years, and house prices skyrocketed. Many people missed this 2020-2021 boom because they'd read too many news articles scaremongering about a property crash. But that came later. After the boom will always follow a crash, and after a crash will always follow a boom. In 2022, 2023, just as the general public began to realize that it was a good time to buy property again, the base rate went from 0.25 to 5.75. I felt sorry for all the people that had not fixed their interest rates for 5 years or beyond. It suddenly became impossible for people to afford their monthly mortgage payments, and many people went into negative equity. Their properties became liabilities. They weren't even able to sell them because the mortgage was higher than the value of the house. Because the market came crashing down, many people went bankrupt, sold for a huge loss, others lost their houses. The lesson is don't take financial advice from anybody. Instead, just watch what the rich people are actually doing and do the same. At the time of speaking, rates are now coming back down to a more sustainable level of interest. And I know this because the longer you fix your mortgage term, the cheaper the rate. Why? Because banks know that rates will decrease. Good property will always hold its value in the same way that gold will. So don't be blown by the wind and worry about what house prices are doing. Don't let your anchor be rooted in fake money that's continually being printed. Inflation is what happens when you lose the purchasing power of your money. According to the Office of National Statistics, inflation typically is around 5.5% per year over the last 50 years on average in the UK. But that figure has often been closer to 10%. In 2022 alone, inflation was 11.1%. That means that if you had £100,000 invested in the stock market and you managed to make a 10% return on your money, you'd still be down over £1,000 negative. If you left £100,000 safely in the bank, then you'd be down to £89,000 in a single year. I don't understand why people leave their money in the bank when they're printing money, because it's losing buying power day by day. And these figures are based straight from the Office of National Statistics, which is owned by the government. In my opinion, inflation is worse than what the Office of National Statistics are even saying. Inflation is subjective to a point because some goods and services increase more than others. These are averages from a whole range of selected chosen goods and services from the government. Therefore, it's possible that the figures are watered down to prevent the public from knowing how drastic inflation crisis really is. The general public is often not financially literate enough to realise that the £100,000 they saved up in 2020 will now only be worth £60,000 in 2025. They know they're broke, but they can't work out why. In the same way, if you receive a pay rise from your boss of 5%, you might have actually taken a pay cut, depending on inflation that year. This is why the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Inflation is wonderful for the rich, but devastating for the poor. Inflation means everything goes up, but if you don't own anything, you only suffer. When inflation went up 11.1% in 2022, everyone was complaining that the costs of goods was going through the roof. Well, literally, the tiles of roofs increased by 40%, and the cost of timber, wood, increased in some cases by 300%. This made me, as a rich person, super happy because I own a lot of timber. And I own many roofs. Rents are increasing by 10% every year, which is terrible for tenants, but fantastic if you have a lot of tenants paying rent.